Good afternoon and welcome everyone to a webinar on barriers to voting featuring Professor Erin O'Brien and sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. I am LWVMA Executive Director Meryl Kessler, and I'm joined here at the controls of this webinar by LWVMA President Marianne Ashton, Bryn Gorman, our membership and Community Engagement Coordinator, and of course, Professor O'Brien. Before Professor O'Brien starts her presentation, let me explain the mechanics of how this webinar is going to work. We have about 50 people participating, which is wonderful. We're delighted at the turnout, but we have muted all of you to prevent background noise and interruptions. On your screen, you should see Professor O'Brien's slides for her presentation. After I introduce Professor O'Brien, she'll present her talk, which should run, I think, about a half hour. We will allow her to finish before we take questions. So there are two ways you can ask questions on this webinar. The first is to type a question into the chat box. To do that, you hover your cursor over the black bar at the bottom of the screen and click on chat. You will then type your question into the box. I can see it and I can read it to the group and to Professor O'Brien, who will answer it. The second way you can ask a question is to, quote, raise your hand. To raise your hand, you again go to the black bar at the bottom of the screen, click on raise your hand, and I will be notified that your hand is raised. I will call on people who have raised their hands, unmute you, and then you can speak. Please be sure that the audio is enabled on your computer if you want to speak. And again, all of the questions will happen after Professor O'Brien is done. If you're having technical problems, please type into the chat box and let us know, and we'll try to help you on our end. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor O'Brien. Professor Erin O'Brien is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Her areas of specialization are poverty politics, campaigning and elections, race in American politics, and American public policy. She's a regular commentator on all things public policy and Massachusetts politics for WGBH and numerous other media outlets. Her scholarship and commentary have been featured in outlets including the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, MSNBC, Time, and Newsweek. I would also add she has been a longtime friend of the League, and we're delighted to have her join us here today. Thank you, Erin.
Pleased to be here, virtually. All right. I feel a little bit like Vanna White because when I say move the slide just moves for me. But more seriously, I wanted, as was indicated, I take real pride in being a longtime friend of the League. The work you guys do, especially in this moment, is incredibly important. And I am aware that I owe a lot of my opportunities to women who have been in the League prior to me and have been active in politics. So I mean that quite sincerely when I say a thanks to you all for the work you're doing. What I was asked to do today is talk about a fairly depressing subject, but to talk about what prevents Americans from getting to the polls. And to do that, not just to do a laundry list of the impediments, so that's important because we can all decide where we might focus our energies of that list of impediments. What's one way I might be able to assist or make that easier for individuals, but also to link it to some policy solutions. If you're going to be advocating, which I know the League does, the State League and the various chapters, if you're going to be advocating for policy change, which policy change are most efficacious for getting more people to the polls and or getting reducing inequality and turnout amongst Massachusetts residents and U.S. residents. So what I've got here is a primer on the academic literature, the empirical findings on what prevents Americans from voting. And so I'm not going to get all jargony. But if you have any questions about the citations and more of the methodologies, gosh, I love questions like that, but I'm happy to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the overall biggest overarching finding. Two scholars found this in 1972, and we continue to find it over and over and over in the literature. And that is, excuse me, the single best predictor of whether or not one votes remains socioeconomic status. The higher one's socioeconomic status, the more likely they are to vote. And it's important, in the United States, a lot of people say, well, duh. I have students who go, no kidding. But this is relatively unique to the American case, or at least the gulf between the affluent and middle and lower income is so much higher in the United States than other countries. And that has that's directly connected to the way we run our elections. But overall, that remains the biggest correlate. The higher SES, the more likely you are to vote, and of course, then the inverse is true. One question then becomes, why this correlation? I can tell you what the correlation is, even controlling for a whole bunch of other factors, but many people rightfully ask, what is it about socioeconomic status that makes it that helps people get to the polls? And there we've seen updates. I have Verba et al.'s work because they were the first to do this. It's Verba, Schlossman, and Brady. Socioeconomic status provides individuals with more time because they tend to have better jobs. It provides them with more resources, things like a car and the ability to access information on the internet, and civic skills. It's simply that the higher SES one has, the more confident they are in negotiating politics. And so what you learn in school, what you gain via education and working in fields that are afforded fairly or unfairly more respect is efficacy. You gain confidence in your ability to negotiate politics. And when you have a question about politics, you don't think, I'm the problem. You're more likely to say politics is the problem, or the politician's the problem, or the way they're presenting the information is the problem. So what this means is that who our legislators hear from, who puts them in office, is wildly tipped towards the affluent. And if the affluent and lower and middle income people had the same political interests, this wouldn't be problematic. But of course, we know that's not true. And we find evidence again and again that because the affluent are who legislators hear from and who they pitch towards in election and re-election, it has real policy consequences. So that's the overall individual level. If you can only find out one piece of information about an individual and you want to predict whether or not they're going to vote, you want to find that out, socioeconomic status. Then we move into placing individuals in their various communities. And here we have three main findings that help further round out or further explain why some people vote and others don't. The first is the mobilization model. And this is actually, I think, really good news for individuals in the league that when contacted after SES, after socioeconomic status, the best predictor of whether or not someone's going to vote is if someone close to them asked them to. And that can be a neighbor, it can be a friend, it can be a sibling. And don't get me wrong, door knocking from the party and things like that helps as well. But if you have a relatively close contact reach out to you, and not admonish you, but reach out to you and say, hey, I think this election's really important. Here's who I'm voting for. Have you thought about this? We find that just one contact like that can make, or often makes, a real difference. And so the SES model can be kind of depressing, whereas the mobilization model can be really good news, that it just takes some reaching out, and individuals are more likely to respond to that. And it doesn't take some orchestrated effort that goes on for months and months. It just takes a simple outreach. And that's not the same as just getting a flyer in your mailbox or something like that. This is an actual contact with a real person. The bad news there is that in the era of candidate-centered elections and increased reliance on technology, that one-to-one contact doesn't happen as much. So good news, bad news there with the mobilization model. The next slide. Then we have something that, quite frankly, is really hard for political activists, people interested in increasing turnout in the United States. This is a real uphill climb. But I put it in here because it is important to think about how the way we structure our government is directly related to how many people turn out. And this is particularly true of young people, because I know the League is very interested in getting young people to the polls and in the organization. We know that young people are politically activated, but also deeply dissatisfied with the two parties. They view it as a lesser of two evils. It is the case that they're more likely to identify with Democrats than Republicans, but in many, though not all cases, it's a hold your nose choice. What we know is that if we did not have single member districts, meaning you vote for obviously an individual, a single member from your district, versus a parliamentary system where you vote for the party and you're apt to have 6, 7 viable parties, that a parliamentary system is much more likely to motivate individual citizens to vote. I don't see this changing anytime in the United States soon. But when we want to understand why other countries are more apt to see higher turnout, and especially higher turnout amongst young people, they have more choices. And it's not a zero-sum game. It is true that in the 2016 election, if you went to the general election and wrote in Bernie Sanders, that was essentially a vote for Donald Trump. But most individuals, especially young people, don't want to think about their vote in a zero-sum sort of fashion. So that is, if Americans were situated in a parliamentary system, turnout would be higher. Third, the next slide. Policy learning, and this is something, this is a literature that I don't think has really reached a lot of organizations, and it's incredibly important. These are just two of the main individuals that have written on this, Joe Sauce and Suzanne Mettler. Suzanne Mettler's work looks at many facets, but one, or probably her book that's the most famous, she looks at the greatest generation. And she asked the question of why has this generation participated more in politics across the life course? Even when we control for SES and all those other things, that generation participated more over the life course than any before or after it. And she does a whole bunch of really highfalutin, I should say, or really impressive analysis. And the answer comes down to the GI Bill, that returning soldiers, not all, there was racial bias in terms of how it was administered, but those who were able to claim the GI Bill, which was a large percentage, were able to go back to college or go to college and get a house when that was not a normative experience for most Americans. What that meant was you learned really positive lessons from government. Government looked out for you. Government was something to engage. Government was something that you viewed favorably and you had a responsibility to participate with. So policy learning, if you have a good experience with policy learning, we learn, to be redundant, that you're more likely to participate. On the flip side, Joe Sauce has looked at welfare claimants. I'm looking right now at student loan debt, that if you have negative experiences with public policy, you're less likely to participate. So we don't often think of like experiences at the DMV or claiming Medicare or Medicaid or getting veterans benefits. We don't tend to think of those experiences as ones that influence whether or not individuals are going to vote. And that's incorrect. If you learn negative messages in public policy because it's punitive or hard to negotiate, you're less likely to participate in politics. But in the inverse, if the policy design is empowering, treats you with respect, and suggests, hey, government wants to hear from you, you're more likely to vote. So those are three big findings of why people do or not participate based on their political communities. The next slide. This, I'm guessing a lot of people in the league know that one of the main reasons Americans participate less than those in other advanced democracies is because, to put it simply, our voting policies are a bit of a nightmare. The first point here is just simple eligibility. Not everyone has the right to vote. This is data, or findings, I should say, from Chris Ugin, who's been at a number of places, including Harvard and the Sentencing Project. And these are some of the findings from his work. That is, 6.1 million people are disenfranchised due to a felony conviction. And this figure has gone up dramatically in recent decades as the population in jail has gone up or under supervision from various criminal justice agencies. There was an estimated 1.7 million disenfranchised in 1976, 3.34 million in 1996, and almost 6 million in 2010. What that means, and I think this is a shocking figure, is that 2.5% of the total US voting age population, or 1 in 40 adults, cannot vote because of a previous felony conviction. Now, it differs by state whether having a felony or how long you've been out, or if you're in prison right now. There's variation amongst the states. But 1 in 40 Americans can't vote because of a previous felony conviction. And this is particularly felt in the African American community. 1 in 13 African Americans of voting age are disenfranchised, and that's 4 times the rate of non-African Americans. 1 in 8 African American men can't vote because of felony disenfranchisement. And some of Chris's other work, he shows how this has affected, and this work's a little bit older, at the time 8 major Senate races and 2 presidential elections. So we hack a bunch of people off the top before we even get to the polls. So felony disenfranchisement cuts a lot of people from the polls. Next slide. Second, and I know the league has done considerable work here at the national and state level, simply the fact that we have a 2-stage process whereby you have to first register and then come back and vote. That, again, is relatively anomalistic compared to advanced democracies, and it's cumbersome. I regularly say to my students, this isn't a partisan issue. I didn't have to register to pay my taxes. They just took the money. And that usually resonates. It's not that government can do this if it wants to. So not only do we have this 2-stage process, it's also that we're a highly mobile populace, that your registration doesn't travel with you. And the registration rules are really confusing. To use myself as an example, I've lived in Virginia, I've lived in Ohio, I've lived in Massachusetts. Each state has its own, this is a very professional term, each state has its own funky set of rules. And they can be hard to figure out, especially if you don't have the same sort of educational attainment as more affluent individuals. For example, in Massachusetts, for really no reason, yes, I know the reasons that have been given to help clerks and things like that, but if you want to vote November 6th, you had to register by October 17th. Well, we know a lot of things have occurred in US American politics since October 17th. What if you get mobilized or excited and decide, yeah, I do want to vote? You are a fairly arbitrary date has prevented you from exercising the franchise. So that 2-stage process is wildly cumbersome for getting individuals to the polls. And it's a policy choice. It's a policy choice that not all states make and most advanced democracies do not make. The next slide. Third, as a political scientist, I hate to put this up here because I love elections. I love lots of them. I don't understand why anybody could be fatigued by them. I'm being a little facetious, but it is the case that, especially in Massachusetts, think how much outreach you guys have done repeatedly. With the special elections and every November, and then generals and primaries. We do it too much. The Olympics are special because it's every 4 years. Elections aren't so special when we're running them seemingly all the time. So the more that it's going on, the less likely people are to engage and think it's important and really prioritize it as a civic duty. The next slide, please. Fourth, and you all as a group are well aware of this, why the heck, and there are reasons, but why is it still a random Tuesday in November that we have most, though not all, elections? Everybody knows this. We could run elections for a week. We can do elections on the weekend. We can do mail-in. There's a lot of ways around this, but we still, in most states, tend to hold our major elections on, the first Tuesday in November, and that contributes to class bias in a lot of ways. It's easier to get to those polls if you have a job that is, 8 to 6 or not 9 to 5. If you're somebody who works multiple jobs or works third shift, getting to the polls on a random Tuesday in November when it's 7 to 7 or 7 to 8, whatever it is fairly cumbersome. Next slide. I love this line of research. This is Zoltan Hajnal is out at University of California, San Diego. And this is something, off-year municipal races. So, for example, the city of Boston does the mayor's race and city council 13, 17, city councils every 2 years, but and 13 and 17. What we know from doing that, there's election fatigue, because why are we always doing these? And it's inefficient from a cost perspective. But what we know from these off-year municipal races, that turnout is low because people aren't paying attention. And when municipalities have moved from off-year to even year, where they're either corresponding with a presidential race or midterm race, like we're about to vote here in a little over a week, that not only is turnout a lot higher when you're running these races in even years, at the municipal level, municipal government, city government, is more likely to look like the city it represents when you're running these in even years. So when you run in odd years, we tend to get, and Boston's a good example, at least at the mayoral level, not so much anymore at the city council level, the mayor tends to be white, a white guy, even in cities that are majority minority, and that tends to differ, or it's more likely to differ when you move to an even year election cycle, which increases turnout. So it not only helps with turnout, it also helps to have descriptive representation, that municipal government looks more like the citizens of said city. Sixth, next slide, yeah. Localism. I already indicated this prior, but I'd like to list it separately. Just the fact that we administer, each state's in charge of its elections, and then each locality, and then each city, creates confusion. Confusion is the enemy of registering to vote. It just makes it harder for people to figure out when and where. And so while many of us on paper like the idea of local government and local control, if you're someone who wants election policies that make it more likely that people turn out and cast a ballot, localism is the enemy of that end goal. Seventh, and here this is some of my own work with Keith Bentley. We are finding that what I call, or we call, restrictive voter access legislation, that is moves for photo IDs, curtailing early voting, increased regulation of registration drives, and the repeal of same-day registration in some states. We find that the states that were most likely to do that are ones that have higher percentages of minorities, and states that have seen an increase in minority turnout. And so you guys obviously know there's been real action, I would argue negative action, around the way the court has recently interpreted the Voting Rights Act. Now that you can do some of this stuff preemptively without preclearance, we're seeing that this legislation is enacted in places where people of color are more likely to be living and when they start turning out to the polls. And so this is yet, the active campaign against the vote cannot be ignored in when we think about voting policy. You know, holding the election on a random Tuesday in November, yes, that's problematic, but it's sort of, this is the way we've always done it. Restrictive voter access legislation, you know, unfortunately, we've always had a tradition in the United States of curtailing the vote for African Americans. But Keith and I call this, you know, Jim Crow 2.0. It's more savvy, but it has similar effects. Moving on, next slide. So then we move here into policy solutions. And I'm not unique, Liz Rigby, and a lot of people who work on voter access scholarship break these down into two types of reform. The first are convenience voting reforms, and they're good. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're not, if you want to cut into that inequality gap in turnout, and it's never been the case in the United States that low-income people and high-income people turn out at the same rate. But if you want to cut into the gulf, if you want to lessen it, convenience voting reforms are not the way to go. Nonetheless, they have a real good government feel to them. But convenience voting is just like it sounds. It makes it more convenient for individuals who are likely to vote anyway, who are middle and higher income people. So things like early voting, which Massachusetts has obviously did in 2016 and has done in most localities now. It makes it easier for people who are going to turn out, and we can see an increase in turnout. It's just that it doesn't cut into the gap between low and high income at all. In Massachusetts now, no excuse to early voting, voting by mail, any of these things that make it easier to vote by not just making it, you can only go on Tuesday from 7 to 8 or 8 to 9, whatever your state's particular polling hours are. All these things make it easier for people to vote, and we can see an increase in turnout, if not a decrease in the gap between the affluent and the less affluent. Then we have registration reforms. And the research shows us that if you want to address inequality in turnout, anything, any policy that can eliminate that two-stage process or make that two-stage process of having to register and then vote, anything that can eliminate that as the single most effective reforms for undermining or cutting into the gap in turnout between the rich and the poor. Massachusetts, I think many of us, I know I'm very happy about automatic voter registration. I've lived here for 11 years now, and we've gone from back of the pack to middle of the pack to, you know, actually getting so much better on voter access. Massachusetts had been a laggard, and now I would argue it's middle of the pack. The adoption of automatic voter registration, which I know Lee was involved in, is a total win. Obviously, it hasn't been implemented yet, unfortunately, but this is a real win for good government, in my view. Next, the next battle, or the next thing a lot of us would like to see, is same-day registration. Same-day registration also does a really good job of curtailing or mitigating somewhat the gap between the affluent and the poor, because you can get excited. Maybe at the last minute, you finally figured out what's going on with issue 1, and you're like, yeah, I want to vote. Well, now you can do it, as opposed to having been told, well, actually, you didn't register by October 17th. Not only does that mean you can't vote, but there's a negative policy learning consequence there. You tend to think, okay, great, thanks. Government doesn't want to hear from me. There's also ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is particularly popular if you want to cut into youth turnout. Because, like I said, younger Americans are less likely to support one of the two parties and don't like having to vote for the major party candidate if they view the major party candidate as a product of the system and corrupted by it. So with ranked choice voting, they could, to use an example, and there are others, it's harder to do in a presidential race, but could put Bernie Sanders 1, Hillary Clinton 2, Donald Trump 3 if they wanted to. It doesn't just work for Democratic candidates either. You could do an inverse sort of thing that you wrote in, I don't even know, Mike Huckabee, then Donald Trump, then Hillary Clinton, then Bernie Sanders. But the more that voters, and especially young people, get to truly express the full of their preferences when it comes to voting, that they don't have to choose in their minds between the lesser of two evils, that can be particularly helpful for motivating younger residents to vote. And we know once you start voting early, you're more likely to do it across your life course. So the more young people we can get to the polls, the more likely it is that we're going to see increased turnout over their life course when it comes to campaigns and elections. So how did I do on time? I did pretty good on time. That's what I have. So I would be happy to take questions, cries of outrage, pushback, any and all questions, welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Erin. That was a great overview and really thought-provoking. And it looks like we have a question. Just give me a minute to get over there to the person asking it. Okay, and we have a question from Linda O'Connell. Linda, I think I just unmuted you. And if you're unmuted on your side, I think you can talk.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are.
All right, hooray. Thank you, Erin. Thank you so much for just a wonderful outline that places all these things so clearly in front of us. I have been wondering if doing local research on which of these barriers particularly affects the population in an individual place might be fruitful in deciding how to approach removing some of these barriers.
That's a great question. I would say that the research isn't there yet. There's a suit and Lowell that's going on right now, having to do with the at-large districts in Lowell, and there's a strong Cambodian population, Asian population, particular Cambodian, and Latino population. And they're arguing that by having at-large districts, that makes it harder for minority voters to see individuals who look like, to elect candidates they want onto the city council. And so there's an example of a direct action that's arguing that the way they're electing counselors is proving to be the impediment. I don't know if I buy that one way or another. I think I'm positive inclined on that. But that research is being done for a suit specifically on Lowell, right? So I would say the best way we have good data on statewide. We don't have good data, to answer your question, on localities within states.
So would you think it would be fruitful for localities to undertake research around their particular populations?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, 100%. And, you know, some of it is when you ask people, you know, why is it you didn't vote? At first, that's not a particularly fruitful question because, you know, you need to dig in deeper there, because individuals will say, oh, you know, I didn't like anybody, or I was busy. But to find out what the voting laws in that particular locality are probably the most important. But yes, there's just not good, there's good research done looking at state variation, but there's not great research done looking at within state variation. And where there is good work done on states, and it's in places like Florida or Ohio that tend to be, or North Carolina, that tend to be constantly under litigation. So red states, solid red states and solid blue states don't usually get the research done on them. It's those, the battleground states.
Great. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks to Erin. So we've got a whole bunch of questions being typed into boxes. So let me throw out one of the questions. First question is, what is the research on lowering voter age, and what are the barriers in Massachusetts?
You know, there's not a ton of research on it, except to say the pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. That's an increasingly popular thing to adopt, because you can get them when they're in schools, right? And so it's easier to register because there's a direct outreach. Now, young people are less likely to vote, but if registered and contacted, you're doing a political socialization over the life course. And so I think it's something that, you know, feels good. I'm guessing turnout would be lower, but you know, you're getting people registered. You're eliminating that first barrier. And if you can do that and do that early, it sets up a pattern for participation over time. So I certainly advocate for it as a policy. I just don't necessarily advocate. If I can only choose one, that's not what I'm going to choose. If I can only choose one thing, I'm going to do automatic voter registration or same-day registration. We already have automatic voter.
Great, thank you. So we have two questions about ranked choice voting, and they're pretty similar, so I'm going to combine them.
Okay.
The questioners would like to know, has ranked choice voting increased voting long term, or what has been more generally, what has been the effect of ranked choice voting?
It hasn't been in place in enough states for long enough to really know. Carolyn Tolbert and Todd Donovan, she's at Iowa and he's on the West Coast. I forget where he is now. I would have to look back. I don't want to speak out of turn. My understanding of that literature right now is that there's just not enough long-term evidence. The hypothesis I would offer is that it's going to increase repeated turnout over time, and it's going to increase turnout in lower ballot races. So, you know, it's unlikely it's going to be done at the presidential level anytime soon. But if you can do a ranked choice ballot, people are more likely to fill out their whole ballot, right, if they get to that. And like, you know, the example that's regularly used is not the Boston mayoral that we just had, but the one prior, that we very well could have seen some different results. So in terms of increasing the vote share over time, I don't know that research. My guess is that it hasn't been in place it just hasn't been there as long. In terms of the research on the way people feel about the efficacy of their vote, that's much more positive with ranked choice voting.
And then sort of building on your point in your answer just now about down ballot races. Someone asks, can any theories be developed on turnout and voter activation when there are less popular top of the ticket races and very popular down ballot or active referendum question campaigns?
Yeah, and I mean, there we find what you guys well know, that the irony is so many of these local issues on a day-to-day level affect citizens more, and they're much less likely to turn out for them. And we just find that over and over and over again. Some of it has to do with salience. You know, it's just a presidential race is, depending on your view, sort of impossible to escape. But these down ballot races that have real impact on people's day-to-day lives, individuals are less likely to turn out for. And so candidates go towards voters that regularly turn out. So individuals who aren't in that camp tend to feel disconnected. But the overall finding is, when you guys know and work to combat that, down ballot races, there's just lower turnout. The one thing that can be done, and I love this, that's why I brought up Zoltan Hajnal's work, is changing it, not, in some localities they already do this, but changing those down ballot races, be they mayoral, be they, an initiative in a particular city, I don't know, to put them on even years. Because turnout's higher in those even years. I would argue for presidential, but even here, like in a midterm year like this, you're going to have much higher turnout, and it has the added advantage of the efficiency argument can be made, and it's a real one, that we don't have to gear up the election apparatus. I mean, Massachusetts has police officers at each polling station. It's costly to run an election. So if you are making the argument that not only would this be better for turnout if we moved down ballot races to even years, and it's more cost effective, you can bring together, that's a powerful coalition. People don't like efficiency and higher turnout are two things most people, at least on paper, like.
Exactly. Thank you. Shifting gears here, a very different question. The question asks, why isn't interfering with citizens voting a crime? Officials in some states appear to do it with impunity. Because voting is the basis of a citizen's rights, it seems like it should be a punishable crime.
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. And, this is one of those places where, I feel like I'm thinking of what's going on in Georgia right now. If you didn't know the partisan labels of, if most Americans didn't know who the Republican was and who the Democrat was, and you told that story of what he is doing, people would be outraged, because it violates this core idea of one person, one vote. We all know that the right to vote is not a guarantee of the Constitution, but it's amongst citizens feel like it is. And so I think that feeling is politically palatable, and is something that can be very positively used. But deciding what one person's interference is another person's protecting voter fraud. Now, we know Lorraine Minute's work and that voter fraud just doesn't happen. It's just, it is a giant misnomer. Our problem in the United States is that people don't turn out, not that they're faking and going in with fake IDs to vote, but nonetheless, it has been politicized and thrown into, we now understand this as Republicans feel X and Democrats feel Y. So the more we can do, like someone like the League, who's nonpartisan, just say that, going after someone's vote should be criminal. It is deeply problematic to call on a higher civic purpose. But, the feelings on it and the political realities of it are very different.
Thanks. So it looks like we have one more question, and I'm not exactly sure what the person writing in was thinking about specifically, so it's a rather broad question. Do you have any research to share on town meeting?
I don't. No, in terms of, well, I can tell my father lives on Cape Cod. I can tell you that anecdotally, and this is not what the person writing in was asking for research, so I realize I'm not providing that with this answer. But the town meeting is something that is, on paper, we love Norman Rockwell, the individuals standing up, their voice shaking. In actuality, the town meeting, when it can go on, I'm thinking of some water issues on Cape Cod for 2-3 hours. That is negative policy learning. People do not enjoy it. There is, or actually I should say, there is some work done on, the town meeting and who's likely to participate and show up, because it requires time to be there. That all the correlates of who tends to go to a town meeting are, as you would guess, more affluent, older, more time, that there's that participation issue. But there's not a ton of work that I'm aware of done on, the democratic implications of a town hall meeting.
Okay, great, thanks. And I misspoke. There was actually one other question hiding in the chat box that I somehow skipped over. So we have time for this one last question, and it's an interesting one. Can you comment on the city-town censuses and the rules for dropping people from the rolls? It seems that it isn't enough just to register.
I mean, I think that really depends on where you live. Yes. Is there a back-ended, are there back-ended efforts to clean up the rolls? Yes. Are there things going on like Georgia or Ohio? Yes. And so this speaks to localism. It's impossible to give one answer, I think, to that question, which is deeply frustrating because people want to know what's going on overall. With this many town clerks working, with this many different states operating, that the practices are hard to uncover. And this is where, the court's decision on the Voting Rights Act is so problematic. If you were in an area or if you were in a covered area, then, you had to get permission basically to make any changes to your voter access or your registration policies. And things like that. And now with the court's decision on the Voting Rights Act, now you can do it, and then a suit has to be brought and the like. So it just speaks to how complicated it is to find out what's truly going on in U.S. American elections and the way in which voters are regularly turned off by that.
Well, thank you. I think that is the last of our questions, except for this last question that says, will LWVMA be sharing Erin's slides? And the answer to that is yes. This entire webinar has been recorded, and we will be able to share out both the slides and the audio. So stay tuned for that. I want to thank everybody who joined us today, and I particularly want to thank Professor O'Brien for providing us with a lot of food for thought and for making time in her super busy schedule to share her knowledge with all of us. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm happy to do it. And the tenor of the questions always makes me think, okay, now I've got 2 more research projects, and that's a really point. So I get a lot from it as well. This is a group that always has very detailed, nuanced questions, and I'm truly appreciative of the work and dedication you guys have towards this cause.
Well, thank you. And thank you everybody on the webinar, and everyone have a good night.
All right. Enjoy the victory.
Exactly. Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.